I moved to the UK when I was 15 from Zimbabwe. Settling into my new environment wasn't a challenge at all for me. Thanks to British colonialism, I was left with a thorough understanding of British culture. What did surprise me when I arrived in the UK was that most people weren't aware of the impact of their national history, particularly where it concerned colonialism. I was reminded of this a couple of weeks ago. I was at a black tie event. I was sat next to a lady in a green dress who asked me where I was from. I told her Zimbabwe, to which she responded with a question I'd heard all too often. Could you speak the language before you came here, or did you only learn it when you arrived? I laughed, because in that moment I was reminded that through her eyes, I was the other, and I was occupying a space her worldview presumed I didn't belong to. I decided to respond with, Zimbabwe is a former British colony. I hoped that that answer would inspire her to use Google. Growing up in Zimbabwe, I was surrounded by stories of my Shona, Indian, and Scottish heritage. I was also surrounded by discourses of people like Cecil John Rhodes, David Livingstone, the Great Zimbabwe Empire, and the Second Chimurenga. But all of these stories seemed to exist in separate bubbles. I didn't quite understand the complexities or the pain embedded in them. In some ways, colonialism was a distant historical fact that didn't hold much relevance in my life. Moving to England changed all this. I suddenly realized that all those stories I had heard growing up were the PG version, that didn't include the nuances of how colonialism shaped and manipulated our self-perceptions. On my first day of school, I was assigned a buddy to help me adjust. I could see the confusion on her face when I told her I was from Zimbabwe. To her, Zimbabwean identity didn't align with somebody who looked like me. And so began a cycle of questions and doubts about my appearance and my heritage. This experience triggered an identity crisis which lingered throughout the rest of my teenage years. I was torn between fitting into the environment I was now a part of and holding on to my cultural heritage. My Zimbabwean roots had begun to feel increasingly further away. It wasn't until I started university that I felt a reconnection to these roots, when Tsitsi Dangarembwa's nervous condition appeared on our reading list. And for the first time, I could see a reflection of my heritage being represented in an environment that had previously overlooked it entirely. Although my experiences were different to that of Tambudzai, the protagonists, I was excited to share my connection with the rest of my class. My excitement was crushed when I overheard my classmates dismissing aspects of Tambudzai's experience because they didn't understand the social dynamics of her world. They seemed to dismiss the cultural intricacies woven into Tambudzai's story, as if to overlook the very impact of colonialism. When they found out I was Zimbabwean, I was involuntarily promoted to the class Shona pronouncer. It was a bittersweet moment, because on one hand, it felt awkward. I was the only person of color and the only Zimbabwean in the room. On the other hand, I felt a sense of relief, because I was finally starting to understand the complexities of my identity and the balancing between the roots I come from, my heritage, and the new world I inhabit. I began to notice that many of our tensions stemmed from a place where we weaponize difference. We've learned a worldview that equates difference with rejection. So when we see identities and cultures that don't quite align with the ones we belong to, we instantly remove ourselves and separate ourselves from them. The problem with this mindset is that it ignores the hybrid identities that develop out of blending cultures. My PhD dove into this concept of hybridity. I had initially planned to examine how colonialism impacted Zimbabwe's political landscape, and I was going to do this by mirroring themes I noticed in the UK. A few months into my study, my focus completely changed, because I came to the realization that although Zimbabwe had independence, it didn't have freedom. colonial systems and ideologies impacted Zimbabwe's society, not just its political landscape. And so my focus shifted to exploring Zimbabwean national identity through playwriting, understanding how diasporic and Zimbabwean-based playwrights negotiated the nation's identity through concepts of race, culture, sexuality, gender, and migration. I began to see this blueprint of oppression. Sometimes the instructions on this blueprint were as brutal as invading and colonizing a nation or rejecting cultural identities. And other times, they were as subtle as inappropriate questions or misinformed judgments. A fundamental point that came out of my study was that there is freedom found in hybridity. Because firstly, it forces us to acknowledge our equal humanity. And secondly, it encourages us to recognize the impact of our histories. A play that really captured this point was Mufaro Makubika's Malindada Zimu. The play follows a Zimbabwean British teenager named Hope. She's approached by her ancestor Lobengula, who is restless because British colonizer Cecil John Rhodes is buried on sacred ground. She's tasked with the mission to remove Rhodes from this sacred ground. The tension between Lobengula and Rhodes shows us that colonialism worked like a virus that infiltrated various aspects of indigenous identity, corrupting its foundations. But that tension finds resolution in Hope. As a hybrid being bridging these two identities, she's able to confront those tensions and that pain in a way her parents and grandparents could not. She symbolizes a moment of truth and reconciliation, showing us that our identities are not bound by our histories, but it is important to acknowledge and recognize the impact of those histories so they can be used to enrich our future and present identities. Now, that concept is not confined just to narratives of Zimbabwean identity. If we look at internationally recognized works like Hamilton, we see a diverse range of musical styles, casting choices, and historical reinterpretations. These works show us that history itself is a hybrid entity, made up of contributions of all those who are part of it. There is an argument that hybridity dilutes cultural purity. In a globalized world like the one we live in, where the events of one community ripple across the world in minutes, hybridity is not a loss. It's an evolution that fosters creativity, enforces empathy, and drives societal progress. So that when we are talking about social injustices and human rights issues, we're able to do so as a matter of our collective community's responsibility, and not as matters separated from ourselves. If our history has taught us anything, it should be that us versus them is a detrimental formula for our world to operate from. By embracing hybridity, we're able to operate from an us versus the problem formula, enriching the lives of all communities and facilitating the healing that's desperately needed. Thank you.